For my final project, I dove into an analysis of extremist ideological trends inside the United States. Many of you will wonder why I chose this topic. I've spent most of the last 25 years as a terrorism analyst for the Department of Defense. One of the most challenging problems our analysts face is identifying the ideological motivations behind attacks and then describing the trends over time. Here are 3 separate examples spread out across 5 decades. On March 1st, 1971, a left-wing extremist group successfully detonated a bomb in the Senate wing of the U.S. Capitol. On February 26, 1993, a religious extremist drove a truck bomb into the World Trade Center parking lot and detonated it beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. On August 12, 2017, a right-wing extremist drove his car into a crowd of people in Charlottesville, Virginia, killing 1 person and injuring 35 others. In addition to these 3 examples, the University of Maryland has documented over 200,000 extremist attacks occurring between 1970 and 2019. Over 5,000 of these occurred inside the United States. These incidents have cost thousands of lives and millions of dollars in damage. Visualizing the problem on a large scale is challenging. Analysts and academics talk about waves of extremism in an attempt to describe the ideological motivation behind these attacks and how those motivations shift over time. The general idea is that the predominant ideological motivation for violence has moved from far-left anti-government in the 1970s to religious Islamic extremism in the late 90s and 2000s to far-right extremism today. The picture is one of waves over time. These assessments have driven policy and resource decisions for programs to counter extremist violence. Understanding which ideological motivations are driving current incidents is essential to targeting these resources effectively. With this background in mind, the research questions for this project are: what shifts, if any, have occurred in the ideology of extremists conducting attacks in the homeland, and can machine learning help identify ideological motivations for attacks? The methodology for answering these questions followed the OSEMN framework described by Dr. Lau in his 2019 article entitled 5 Steps of a Data Science Project Lifecycle. I obtained the data directly from the University of Maryland website. The 2 sets I used were available in Excel spreadsheets and had detailed codebooks that explained the categories and methods for collection. I had to scrub each data set. The effort at this stage was accurately identifying incidents that occurred inside the United States. After joining the sets, I had to manually research over 200 extremist groups that had not been coded with a specific ideology. Exploring the data was an exercise in slicing features and creating visualizations to highlight unique insights from each. For modeling, I ran the clean data through a machine learning algorithm to see if this method could provide efficiencies for analysts trying to identify trends. And finally, this presentation and the associated paper were the mechanisms I chose for communicating the results of the analysis above. The foundation of any data science project is, of course, the data. The sources for this project are both from the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. The first is the Global Terrorism Database, which provides data on worldwide extremist incidents beginning in 1970 and covering to 2019. The second source is the Profiles of Perpetrators of Terrorism in the U.S. database, which focuses on extremist groups and individuals who have conducted attacks inside the U.S. Combining the datasets resulted in over 200,000 entries. Once the attacks outside the U.S. were removed, the resulting dataset had nearly 3,000 incidents with over 70 separate descriptive features for each. Before going too far into the exploration and analysis, we need to establish what we're talking about. Defining what is or is not a terrorist attack is an entire project unto itself. For this project, both the GTD and PPT define a terrorist attack as the threatened or actual use of illegal force and violence by a non-state actor to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, or intimidation. Having established a project's definition of terrorism and the criteria for data inclusion, we can begin to explore the data. The datasets characterize attacks and perpetrators into 5 dominant ideologies. These ideologies are extreme right-wing, left-wing, religious, ethno-nationalist, separatist, and single issue. The first 3 are the ones I will use to compare to the existing assessment of ideological waves in future slides. The ethno-nationalist trend nearly matches the left-wing trend, with a peak early in the time period and a taper thereafter. This makes sense given that the focus of these groups often overlapped, with left-wing extremists often supporting the nationalist revolutions the ethno-nationalists were fighting for. The single-issue ideological trend has a fairly steady heartbeat. This category acts as a catch-all for the attacks that met the criteria for inclusion in the data but did not meet the definitions of other ideological categories. While this project focused on the dominant ideologies, there were a few key sub-ideologies that merited further analysis as a means of providing context to the larger ideological motivations. Extreme right-wing sub-ideologies were dominated by racial issues or anti-Semitism. This was followed closely by xenophobic or anti-immigrant ideologies. The overlap generates a picture of an ideology dominated by extreme views on racial and social supremacy. The attack trend for the next two sub-ideologies mirrors the broader trend for right-wing extremism. Notably, however, the rise in the number of attacks for these sub-ideologies is more pronounced. For left-wing sub-ideologies, the bulk of the focus was on Marxism, Leninism, and communism, socialism. The trend for attacks linked to these sub-ideologies mirrors the broader left-wing trend. Both of these dropped from favor with the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the USSR. Attacks motivated by religious sub-ideologies were fewer in number. Not surprisingly, Shia and Sunni Islamic extremism topped the list. Shia extremist attacks peaked during the period surrounding the Iranian Revolution, while Sunni extremist attacks took off after 9/11 and have continued since. When we look at single-issue sub-ideologies, it is anti-abortion and ecological motivations that made up the bulk of the attacks. While neither have a clear trend line, anti-abortion motivated attacks began growing after the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, and eco-terrorist attacks gained prominence beginning in the mid-1990s. Now that we've established a baseline for what motivated attacks, it's useful to look at some of the characteristics of the attacks themselves. In particular, the data provided insights into location, attack types, targets, weapons, and casualties. During the 50-year period from 1970 to 2019, every state experienced at least one extremist attack. 4 states, California, New York, Illinois, and Florida, and Puerto Rico, made up over half of the total attacks. Within these, it was the metropolitan areas of San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City, Chicago, San Juan, and Miami that contributed most to their attack numbers. Bombings were the most common attack type. This makes sense given that they were the preferred attack for left-wing and ethno-nationalist extremists, and these two groups were the most prolific attackers during the period. Again, the left-wing and ethno-nationalist ideological preference for targets made businesses the most prolific. The choice of weapons matched up to the dominant attack type. Explosives led the list. When tied with incendiary devices, over 80% of all attacks involved one of these two methods. Finally, exploring casualty data revealed some different trends. While left-wing, ethno-national, and single-issue motivations dominated the overall numbers and many of the previous attack characterizations, they did not generate the largest number of casualties. This could be intentional, or it could be linked to their choice of targets. Even after removing the large numbers of dead and wounded during the 9/11 attacks, religiously motivated attacks were the most likely to generate casualties, with right-wing attacks following closely. Both motivations exceeded the number of casualties per attack by far and outpaced the average across all 5 ideologies. So having looked at the motivations and the characterization of the attacks during the period, we can go back to our first part of our research question. What shifts, if any, have occurred in the ideology of extremists conducting attacks in the homeland? Here again is our current assessment with 3 clean waves from left through religious to right wing. It looks good, but is it accurate? Using the data, we can create a similar view of the period and see if the ideological waves follow the assessed pattern. While the data included 5 dominant ideologies, I only looked at the 3 that were used in the assessed wave: right, left, and religious. In this case, the left-wing incidents seemed to follow the assessment closely. The extreme right-wing incidents seemed to match up as well. The religiously motivated incidents are not as pronounced as the assessed waves would have us expect. Overall, the picture is not as clear as I had hoped. To improve the clarity of our assessment, we needed a different method. Combining the visuals and plotting the attacks in a time-based heat map gives us a better picture of what is happening. The standing assessment or analytic line is that there have been 3 waves of ideological motivation: left, religious, and now right. Using the data, we can see that the reality does not quite match the simplicity of this assessment. Attacks motivated by extreme left-wing ideologies do drop off in the early 80s. Many left-wing extremists were inspired by the battle for civil rights and the protests against the Vietnam War. Unsurprisingly, when these became less of an issue, the activities of these groups decreased as well. At the other end of the timeline, extreme right-wing groups have increased their activity since 2010. However, this is not a new phenomenon, as these groups have consistently conducted attacks in some form since 1990. This wave was there longer than we thought. It just grew faster in the last decade. In the middle of the period are the attacks motivated by religion. The wave is not as pronounced, and the number of attacks is not as high as the others. The pattern we do see in the data is that extremist attacks inside the U.S. spike during times of national division. Whether it was the schism caused by civil rights in Vietnam driving left-wing extremists to take up arms, or whether it is the right-wing extremists who feel disenfranchised in the modern political climate and are seeking to gain more influence. The activities of both sides seem to reflect the political divides of the times. What does this mean for today and more importantly tomorrow? Based on the analysis of both ideological motivations and attack characterizations, the future is not rosy. The data shows a rise in right-wing extremism on top of an existing, albeit smaller, wave of religious extremist attacks. The combination of these two will make for a difficult road ahead. Both ideologies prefer armed assaults with firearms on private citizens. Requiring minimal planning and using readily available resources, these types of attacks are the hardest to detect and prevent. More disturbingly, both of these ideologies lead the field in casualties per attack. In order to identify and plan for shifts and overlaps in extremist ideologies, we need to start paddling sooner. Wait, what? What does paddling have to do with any of this? One of the keys to surfing is seeing the wave early so you can start to paddle before it gets to you. If you don't do this, you risk missing the wave entirely as it rolls under you, or the worst outcome, you get crushed by the wave when it breaks on top of you. Planning a government response to extremism is similar. You need to identify the next threat or wave early enough to plan resources, start paddling, to counter the threat. Unfortunately, we can see the wave, but it is often too late to do anything meaningful. The current state of data collection and analysis on violent extremist ideologies is slow. The actual data is 3 years behind. The reasons for this are many, with the largest being that identifying the true ideological motivation behind a given attack is often difficult. Why humans do things is inherently complex. These questions and others contribute to analysts having to generate a picture for leaders based on what they see or feel from their individual position. One way to accelerate our ability to identify ideological trends may be to look to machines for help. The second part of the research question for this project was, can machine learning help identify ideological motivations for attacks? To test this, I applied a supervised machine learning method to the existing data on attacks between 1970 and 2019. The method I chose is called K-nearest neighbors, or KNN. Using this method, the machine looks for patterns and then classifies its answers based on where its answers fall most closely, the nearest neighbor. The challenge for this effort was that I needed to have the machine identify which of the 5 dominant ideologies a given incident may fall under. To solve this, I created a run for each ideology. This allowed me to ask the machine to provide a binary yes-no answer to the question of which ideology most likely motivated a given attack. To confirm if I was on the right track, I used a cross-validation method and tested the data using 4 other methods to ensure the KNN results were not outrageously far off. The results of the experiment with this method were mixed. The accuracy of the machine's answers ranged roughly around 80 to 90%, but the machine's accuracy for identifying religiously motivated attacks was over 97%. This sounds great, but it's more likely that there's a variable in the data that is pointing too closely to the answer and essentially allowing the machine to cheat. Data scientists love more data like a skateboarder loves Red Bull. We can never get enough. Aside from identifying the rogue variable that is boosting the accuracy for religiously motivated attacks, more data on things like the perpetrators could help increase confidence in the model outcomes. While trying to avoid any accusations of profiling, there are some backgrounds, age groups, nationalities, economic levels that do seem to anecdotally match certain ideologies. Having this data may help the machine refine its pattern for certain types of motivation. So what have we learned? First, waves do exist, but they are more complex than we described. The current assessment of waves of extremism is largely correct, although it may be overly simplistic. Accurately targeting counter-violent extremism resources requires more detail than an anecdotal wave chart. Secondly, a classifying algorithm can tip and cue analysts but needs more detail. Using machine learning to classify the motivations behind extremist attacks can help analysts look for upcoming waves. This is the equivalent of a fellow surfer saying, "Hey man, I think I see a wave building out there." Having more detailed data, particularly about perpetrators, will help the machine give more confident warning. Finally, right-wing extremism is becoming the greatest ideological threat. Extreme right-wing motivated attacks are on the rise. Events like the 2017 Charlottesville incident or the 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol highlight the threat from groups and individuals motivated to violence by their belief in this ideology. This wave of extremism began growing steadily over 8 years ago. We largely missed this wave and are now paddling furiously to keep from letting it get away from us. Thank you.